Hello again, welcome back to my series on John 8:58. Now, last time we spoke about the Pharisees not understanding Jesus, and unlike their ancestor Abraham, who was able to intellectually see the Christ's day and see the Christ through the promises and the vision that had been given of the Messiah, that the Pharisees, even standing in front of Jesus, seeing him, hearing his words, they just didn't understand. Their hearts and their minds were closed off to this illegitimate Galilean in their eyes. Now, today I want to have a look at the context of this conversation and look further into the mind of the Pharisees to see exactly what they were thinking, how they were viewing Jesus. And to do that, I'm going to look at a number of textbooks that I've studied over the years, which has now given me, I believe, a much better understanding of this passage and how the Trinitarians and the Arian Jehovah's Witnesses, who both look to this passage, are both wrong in the way that they interpret it. So we're going to have a look at quite a lot of information in the next half an hour, and hopefully we can unpack it all and get through it. So first of all, I wanted to draw your attention to this publication, The Gospel of According to John by C.K. Barrett. It's an excellent commentary, and he makes an interesting point here about this passage. So after this great discussion about Abraham being the father and seeing Jesus' day, he tells us in page 351 that the belief that to Abraham would disclose the secrets of the age to come is at least as old as a discussion and argument between Rabbi Akiba and Rabbi Zakkai. Zakkai holding that God revealed to Abraham this world only, while Rabbi Akiba believed that the age to come also had been revealed to him. If he were shown the age to come, this would include the days of the Messiah. So it's quite clear that in rabbinic thinking, which is a later thinking to the context in John 8:58, but nonetheless, there was this Israelite view that Abraham had been given a vision of the future, a vision of the glory of the Messiah. And this is what Jesus was referring to. And I just want to share with you some further information on this. I want to take you to... Now, this is a study by a chap called David Ball, and it's really about the full context of the I am sayings in the New Testament and the Old Testament. And here on page 218, he makes an interesting point here that a particularly interesting parallel to John 8:58 occurs in the Targum of Isaiah 43. This is a Targum Jonathan. So if we were to turn to Isaiah 43, he says, what is most striking is the reference to Abraham, who is nowhere mentioned in the text of Isaiah itself. So if you look up Isaiah 43, in verse 12, in fact, in most translations, it will basically just read without any mention of Abraham. But in this Targum Jonathan, it reads that I am he that is from the beginning. Yea, the everlasting ages are mine, and beside me there is no God. I, even I, am the Lord, and beside me there is no Saviour. I declared to Abraham, and let me just bring up the next page. I declared to Abraham, your father, what was about to come. I delivered you from Egypt, etc. So he says the mention of Abraham in the Targum of Isaiah is particularly attractive for the study of John 8:58. The tradition that Abraham was given a view of the future could could plausibly be alluded to in 8:56, where Jesus says, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it and was glad." So he says that this can only be regarded as a possibility that John knew and referred to the Targumic tradition. So let's just actually have a look at the Targum Jonathan, Isaiah 43 and verse 12, and there it is again. I redeemed you out of you, or I have declared unto Abraham your father. So the Targum, this interpretive edition of the Old Testament, written in Aramaic, inserts this phrase about Abraham having the future declared to him. And this is what Jesus was referring to, and this is what John is probably referring to in this passage. And as we saw before, the Pharisees have misunderstood this. They think that Jesus is saying that he lived in Abraham's day and that he saw Abraham. And that's the reason why the Jehovah's Witnesses use it as well, because they believe that Jesus pre-existed his earthly sojourn and saw Abraham from the heavens, as it were. But no, the passage is saying that according to the Jewish Targums, it was believed that Abraham had this vision of the Messiah. Abraham saw the Messiah's day, not that Jesus pre-existed in Abraham's day. So, but we also see in that passage that the Pharisees want to stone him after saying that before Abraham was, I am. So they're hearing what they think is a blasphemy. Okay, now why is that? This is what we want to find out today. Now, I used to think when I first studied this many years ago that, as we've seen in previous videos, the expression that Jesus uses here in the Greek is Ego Eimi, which corresponds to the Hebrew phrase anihu, which is used predominantly in the book of Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, and basically can simply mean I am he, I am that person. And we saw the blind beggar in chapter 9 uses exactly that same absolute term without a predicate to say that, yes, I am that blind beggar. I am he, the one you're talking about. But then I read this book a few years ago by Raymond Brown, one of the most important 20th century theologians, Catholic theologian, his introduction to New Testament Christology. And when I read this book, he mentions pages 138 and 139 how the phrase anihu actually comes from the Deutero-Isaiah passages where Yahweh, Jehovah, continually says that I am he, referring to himself as the only God and the only means of salvation for the Israelites. And it came to be understood, it was so emphatic that if you look at the Jewish Encyclopedia today, they talk about God having 72 names, 72 sacred names, one of which they take Anihu to be a sacred name. It's not a name as such. It's obviously a phrase, but it's used so emphatically that it becomes to be taken as a name of God. So this is a point. We saw that the Exodus 3:14 uses a completely different Hebrew phrase. It doesn't use anihu. It says ego eimi ho'on in the Greek and eche asha eche in the Hebrew. So we saw that there's no connection between Exodus 3:14, the name eche or the name Yahweh, that the Trinitarians try to point to in this passage. But as Brown is saying, there is a connection to the book of Isaiah and this substitute name for God of Anihu. So much so that he says in page 139, against this background, the absolute use of I am by the Johannine Jesus becomes quite intelligible. He is speaking in the same manner in which Yahweh speaks in Deutero-Isaiah. Okay, so yes, Jesus appears to be using a form of a divine name here in this passage, but is he claiming to be Yahweh? And if not, then why is he using this substitute name for God? We could also think about passages in, for instance, Mark chapter 14, if we were to look at it, verses 61 to 64, where Jesus is before the high priest Caiaphas, who asks him, "Are you the Christ?" And Jesus replies, "I am." And when he says that, Caiaphas rips his robes and again says, see, he's committing blasphemy. And in John chapter 18, verse 6, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Judas and the temple guard, the temple priests and soldiers arrive to arrest him, Jesus says, "Who are you looking for?" And they say, "Jesus, the Nazarene." And he says, "I am, Ego Eimi, I am he." And what do they do? The passage says they fall to the ground and prostrate themselves. So again, Trinitarians look at these passages and say, he's obviously claiming to be Yahweh, because they're claiming blasphemy, or they're bowing down before him when he says Ego Eimi. So why are they reacting like this? What is the truth of this matter? Well, it's actually, there's a play on words being used here with the term Ego Eimi. Another fantastic read is this book by John A.T. Robinson, The Human Face of God, and this is an unbelievably good read. The passages on Jesus and whether he pre-existed or not. And but talking about John 8:58, in pages 176 and 177, Robinson says here that for he, that is Jesus, for he, John, the gospel writer, is deliberately telling two stories, two histories at once, and superimposing them on each other. Okay, so he's saying that it's almost like a double meaning in this passage. Double entendre we talk about is like a phrase that, or words that say one thing but could also mean something else. The double entendre in the general use usually means like a risque second meaning. But the point is that double entendre, is saying something which could have two meanings. And this is what Robinson's talking about in this passage. We're seeing two meanings being superimposed over each other. He says the first is the story of the Logos, the history of God's wisdom, being totally incarnate in him and Jesus. So much so that he can speak, that is, Jesus can speak directly in the name of God and utter the divine I am. Such a voice can only come from the world above. Indeed, it is God speaking and acting. Consequently, its arche, or its origin, its beginning, is not just the moment of Jesus' birth, but is before Abraham. Now he says, as the embodiment of this I am, Jesus does not speak of himself. Right? I'll read that again. As the embodiment of this divine name I am, Jesus does not speak of himself. It is no wonder, therefore, that sometimes he sounds like a ventriloquist dummy. Okay? So what he's saying here is that Jesus is embodying what the divine name I am signifies. And he's not speaking of himself, but he's speaking of the one that whose name that is, and what he's embodying. So basically, there's a double meaning here. So when he's saying, when the gospel writer is writing, Jesus' words were Ego Eimi, he's saying, I am who I've said I am. But because that phrase, I am he, is so intimately connected with the Anihu of Deutero-Isaiah, that it has this double meaning. It's alluding to the divine name. Now, it's not the proper divine name, but it's alluding to the proper divine name. Now, further on this, I want to take you to another book by Raymond Brown, which is his commentary on the Gospel of John. And I want to start with page 341, because even further to this double meaning in the phrase Anihu or Ego Eimi, there's even more meaning and more background to this. So we read in page 341, where talking about the passage where Jesus is saying that he has been sent by God, sent by the Father. It says, I have at my side the one who sent me, literally, but I am the one who sent me. Now, accordingly, he refers to theologian Dodd's interpretation of the Gospel of John, points out that the divine statement, Ego Eimi, or I am he, plays an important role in the Gospel of John. Often appears in post-biblical Hebrew in the form I and he. In fact, there is evidence that the latter form was used in the tabernacle ceremony of circling the altar. I and he seems to underline the quasi-identity of God and his people. Thus, according to Dodd, in saying, I am the one who sent me, Jesus is using a form of the divine name and implying his solidarity with the Father. So when Jesus is saying that the Father has sent him and I and the Father are one, and he's using the phrase I am, he's in effect using phrases that conjures up in the minds of the listeners these words or these names of God, and liturgical usage of the names of God in the Festival of Tabernacles. And if we turn further to page 360, he also talks about Abraham, confirming for us that there are later rabbinic traditions that Abraham saw the whole history of his descendants in a vision, saying that God revealed to Abraham the end times. So again, Jesus, by referring to what Abraham saw and referring to the words that he was speaking and the miracles he performed, he's basically saying that the end times have arrived and that Yahweh is about to save his people, the Israelites. And if we look at page 534, he also talks about this play in words. It says, John may well be giving us an epiphany scene, and thus playing on both the ordinary and the sacral use of the term Ego Eimi. So he's making the point that Ego Eimi can be understood in an ordinary way and also in a sacramental, liturgical way. The soldiers and police who have come to the garden across the Kidron to arrest Jesus announce that they're seeking Jesus, and Jesus answers, Ego Eimi. This means I am he. But the fact that those who hear it fall to the ground when he answers, it suggests a form of theophany, which leaves men prostrate in fear before God. Once again, John seems to be playing on a twofold use of Ego Eimi. Okay, so there's our play on words. But he's making the point that in hearing those words, they're understanding that there's a theophany taking place here. It's a manifestation of God. Not God himself, but a manifestation in the way that, say, at the burning bush, when Yahweh appears to Moses, the account tells us it's the angel of the Lord. So it is the Lord, but it's actually his angel. It's a theophany, a manifestation. And in the First Temple period, before the exile in Babylon, the scriptures and the Israelite writings tell us of God's presence in the temple and the tabernacle was manifested by the Shekinah light that would appear. And when that light appeared in the inner courtyards, that meant that God's presence was within the temple. So we're seeing here that the use of the theophanic name, I am, manifests a theophany. And that's why the guards coming to arrest Jesus, when they hear that name, they're bowing down prostrate because they're appreciating a theophany of God. And finally, from Brown, if we look at 537, page 537, he talks about God gives other passages to show that not only the Greek form Ego Eimi, but also the Hebrew form Anihu served as a divine name in the liturgy. A variant form Ani Wehu, meaning I and he, was also used, and Dodd thinks that it indicated the close association or quasi-identification of God and his people. So he says that Jesus is presented as speaking in the same manner in which Yahweh speaks in Deutero-Isaiah. John draws attention to the implications of divinity in the use of Ego Eimi by Jesus. So that's Brown, helps us to see that, understand that. Now he mentions Dodd there. So C.H. Dodd, another great English theologian, and this is his masterful interpretation of the fourth gospel. And we'll just look at this quickly. And again, he gives us more information about this Festival of Tabernacles. He says, however, there was a tradition which gave for Anihu the slightly altered form Ani Wehu, and this was said to be the Shem HaMeforash. It says that when at the Feast of Tabernacles, the priests circled the altar chanting the Hosanna, and they sang Ani Wehu. The intention was apparently to disguise the pronunciation of the sacred name Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton. But special significance was attached to the form Ani Wehu, I and he. It was taken to stand for the intimate association or quasi-identification of God with his people. The sentence is to be understood in the sense that in rescuing Israel, God rescues himself. And he goes on to say that while on one hand the name Ani Wehu thus suggests the solidarity of God with his people in their troubles, on the other hand it implies the duty of Israel to become like God. So the phrase means I and he implies a community of character between God and Israel. So he says that it is difficult not to see here an allusion to the divine name Anihu. The implication would seem to be that God has given his own name to Christ. Okay, I'll read that again. The implication would seem to be that God has given his own name to Christ. Thus, the eternal glory of God is given to Christ, and in the same act, the name of God is glorified. Now, this harks back to the angel of the Lord in Deuteronomy 32, where we're told that the Israelites must obey the angel of the Lord because the Lord's name is within him. And the Shem HaMeforash, this holy name of God, it imbues the one that it's been given to with the authority, the agency of God. So the angel of the Lord represents the Lord and can speak as Yahweh, much the same way that Moses and Aaron or to be the mouthpiece before Pharaoh, so that when Moses and Aaron spoke to Pharaoh, Pharaoh was hearing the words of Yahweh. He wasn't hearing Moses and Aaron. They were the agents representing Yahweh and speaking for him. And this is what Robinson was getting at when he's saying that Jesus comes across like a ventriloquist dummy. Jesus is uttering the words, but they're the words of the Father that he's using. So he's the visible manifestation of the words of the Father. He is the Shekinah, the theophany of God's presence. That's what he's basically saying to the Pharisees. But because of this, they're hearing this phrase "Anihu." Now, personally, I think Jesus may have actually uttered "Ani Wehu," this alternative phrase, which is still taken to be as the substitute for the divine name that is mentioned during the Festival of Tabernacles. So they're hearing that name, and the point is that it's the high priests and the Levitical priests who should be using that name and them only. I want to refer you to one last reference. It's a book called Jesus and His Story by Ethelbert Stauffer from 1959, which is, again clarifies this for us. He says that the temple in Jerusalem was the site of the presence of God. Hence, the great temple festivals were in essence theophanic celebrations. This was particularly true of the Festival of Tabernacles, or Sukkoth, this very festival that John 8:58 is centered on. He says special emphasis is placed upon the theophanic formula "I am He," or Anihu, which he says comes from Deutero-Isaiah. He says, Anihu may be regarded as an all-inclusive summary of God's self-revelatory declarations in the ritual of the Feast of Tabernacles. At the altar, the choir of priests sang, God is in the temple. And the Levites sang, Ani, Anihu. They repeatedly sing, Ani Wehu. And it says that they were also allowed to proclaim the theophanic Anihu. So he's saying that it's the priests and then the high priests, they were the ones that were allowed to use the name Anihu and Aniwehu during this festival. So only them. So here we have Jesus speaking to the Pharisees, and he's using the phrase Anihu, or even Aniwehu, I and he. He's using the phrase that is the high priests have to use. And that's why when he used it before Caiaphas was the high priest. He's seeing Jesus as usurping his authority as high priest. That was the blasphemy. The Pharisees in John 8:58 are seeing Jesus at the Festival of Sukkoth taking on the role of the high priest and pronouncing this holy name. So Jesus is saying to them, I am the high priest. I am the agent. I am the Messiah. I have the authority. I have God's name. You see, he's not claiming to be God. He's claiming to be God's agent. And Stauffer finishes off from page 193 by saying the content of the Anihu formula, there can no longer be any doubt of what Jesus meant when he used it. He was in all deliberation using the Old Testament and liturgical formula of God's self-revelation. He wished to convey that in his life, the historical epiphany of God was taking place. On page 194, he concludes, it was the boldest declaration, I am He. This meant, where I am, there God is, there God lives and speaks. So this whole passage, John 8:58, is not a claim to be God. but rather it was a claim by Jesus that he was the Messiah. He was the promised seed of Abraham. He was the theophanic manifestation of God's presence. He was the Shekinah that was now dwelling with God's people, guaranteeing that God was with them and that this was the last days and that God was going to bring salvation. He was the manifestation of God's presence. So that was no blasphemy. He was fulfilling the role of the high priest. But to the Pharisees and the high priests of the day, they simply viewed him as a usurper, an illegitimate Galilean who didn't have the authority. But Jesus was saying, I speak the words of the Father. The Father has shown, is my witness. He has shown by the works that I do that he is with me. Anyway, who I and he. So there you have it. That was a lot to unpack in 30 minutes. That's information that's taken me a number of years to find. But I think it's treasure that I've found, and it helps to give me, I believe now, a true and full understanding of this passage, which is not Trinitarian, which is not Arian, but confirms the Unitarian view that Jesus was not God himself, but he was God's Messiah, God's manifestation, his agent, his messianic king, speaking on behalf of the Father. So I hope you've enjoyed that. If you have any comments, please add them to the comments section. If you've liked the video, please like it, subscribe if you've enjoyed the video. I've got more topics and passages that we can examine, so hopefully you'll join me again the next time. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.